Today's proceedings are being live streamed. Those with electronic devices may use them to report what they have heard in the hearing room, but only after 15 minutes have elapsed since the event that they're reporting. Those devices may not be used for recording. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. MacLeod, I'm going to ask that we start this morning by having on the screen a part of your witness statement. It's page 36, paragraph 82. MPS 0748808. Page 36, paragraph 82. Sorry, it must be page 35 to begin with. Thank you. And you were asked when you gave your statement about your awareness of various police discipline regulations. And I want to ask you about what you said at paragraph 82D in particular. At the bottom of the page and going over to the top of the next page, please. Right, and you said this: I have been asked what type of conduct I think would amount to discreditable conduct in the context of a long-term undercover deployment. The definition given in the legislation is very broad, but I would encapsulate it as behaving in a way that is morally wrong or generally regarded as bad behaviour, and where the UCO could not show that the conduct was a necessary part of their behaviour in role. You go on to offer up an example that I'm not going to ask you any detail about, but the example was an officer who was involved in a drink drive incident. All right. What I want to ask you is this, following on from yesterday's questions: do you regard deceitful sexual relationships as discreditable conduct?
Yes.
The fathering of a child, as Robert Lambert did, discreditable conduct?
Yes.
Did you regard the commission of crimes by undercover officers as discreditable conduct?
Yes.
In all circumstances?
There may be extenuating circumstances on occasions where that may not be applicable.
I'll come back to ask you some more detail about that. Can I ask you specifically, first of all, about one allegation that is made regarding Robert Lambert, and I'll do that by reference to an intelligence report. So can we have on screen, please, MPS 0742720. It's a report dated in October of 1986, so it's just before you came into the role in the SDS. Excuse me. And I want to focus on paragraph 3, please. It's a report, its subject heading is the ALF. But I want to ask you about what's set out in the bottom part of paragraph 3. Paragraph 3 is about an individual producing material, printed materials. And it says this: one of his first orders is from London Greenpeace for the printing of a new McDonald's fact sheet, a clearly libellous publication, certain to be of interest to the lawyers of this worldwide hamburger chain. Right, so a report in part about a leaflet being provided that is described in the report as clearly libellous. The evidence to this inquiry is that Robert Lambert, in his undercover identity, contributed material to that leaflet that went on to be the subject of libel action by McDonald's in the early 1990s. were you aware at any stage that Robert Lambert had contributed to a leaflet, an anti-McDonald's leaflet, if I can term it that for these purposes?
I wasn't aware at the time. I became aware subsequently.
Do you mean in the course of this inquiry?
Yes.
You became aware, or before that?
Well, before that, yes, I became aware of it. Yes, I can't remember at what point, but I was aware.
And how did you become aware?
I think there must have been something in one of his intelligence reports.
So, whilst you were still serving in the SDS?
I think I might have been on C Squad by then. I'm not sure if that was during the time I was in post,
But,
or whether it was subsequent to me.
Understood on the dates, but just in terms of how you became aware then, it was through intelligence reporting.
Yes, I believe so.
And is your recollection that you saw some intelligence reporting which suggested that Robert Lambert had contributed to the McDonald's fact sheet?
I didn't see anything that suggested that. I was aware that these publications were being circulated, but I didn't see that.
I see. So the intelligence was to the effect that this sort of literature was being circulated. My question was aimed at any knowledge that Bob Lambert had contributed to the creation of the literature. Did you hear or see anything to that effect?
No.
Did you yourself have any contact with McDonald's?
No.
At any stage?
No.
Were you aware of individuals by the name of Sid Nicholson, a former police officer who went on to work for McDonald's?
No.
Or Terry Carroll?
No.
Were you aware of McDonald's having their own private investigators, their own agents in London Greenpeace at any stage? Are you quite sure about that?
I'm certain.
If that had been the case, what would your reaction have been to the presence of McDonald's agents in the same groups as your undercover officers? Would that have caused you any concern?
Well, McDonald's are entitled to do what they see fit to do. Provided that there was no sort of collusion with Lambert.
So it might have concerned you had there been collusion between private agents acting for McDonald's and your undercover officer?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we take that down? I want to move now to ask you more generally about the involvement of undercover officers in criminal activity. And can we start, please, by looking at your witness statement, page 155, paragraph 269A. In fact, could we have 269, thank you, and A? Right, you were asked about some phrases in the notes of your conversation with Operation Hearn. One which was to the effect there was no acceptable level of criminality by field officers, and the other that inevitably they would get caught up in public order offences. And you said this at 269A. Perhaps I spoke too loosely in the Hearn interview. I did classify public order offences as criminal offences at the time I was an SDS manager. They are still offences under the law. Public order offences were an occupational hazard for UCOs. They often got caught up in arrests for such offences, though I know of no convictions. Public order offences were low-level offences like obstructing the street in demonstrations. However, there is a distinction to be drawn between low-level public order offences and other acts of criminality, for example, damage to property, common in the ALF. The latter is a step too far. I maintain that there is a distinction between condoning criminal behaviour and dealing with inevitable but regrettable arrests. Does that paragraph accurately set out your attitude, your views
Yes.
to criminality by undercover officers?
Yes.
So accepted that they may get caught up in situations which led to their arrest for public order offences, is that right?
Yes, there's an occupational hazard.
As I understand what you're saying there, though, it would be in circumstances in which they hadn't planned to be involved, but they were caught up in the moment. Is that fair?
Exactly.
And you would draw a distinction between that and criminal damage as an example of crime that you would not consider they should be involved in. Is that a fair assessment of what you're saying?
Yes, I think it is, yes.
Correct me if I'm misrepresenting you.
No, I think that is an accurate summation.
Were the undercover officers under your command told by you that you considered something like criminal damage to be a step too far?
I never had occasion to actually say that. I have to assume that their intelligence would be sufficient for them to be the mature officers, for them to be aware of what is acceptable and what is not.
But how would they know where exactly you drew the line if you didn't tell them?
Well, I suppose a lot of that is just by intuition. I can't foresee how one could sit down and have a discussion on what is permissible and what is not. I mean, they're trained police officers, they know right from wrong. And there's a limit to how far one can go in terms of wet nursing mature officers.
The undercover role is quite different from ordinary policing, if I call it that, isn't it? Because,
Yeah.
for example, you're contemplating that they might be arrested for a public order offence in their undercover role.
Yes,
That's quite distinct from the life of a police officer
Yeah.
on other duties, isn't it?
yes,
The expectation as a police officer would be that you don't get arrested for anything, full stop, wouldn't it?
correct,
So they were going to be crossing the Rubicon as a
Correct.
police officer
yes,
by getting arrested for a public order offence, potentially.
yes.
Wasn't it important then to tell them you're going to cross that line, possibly, and that's okay, but don't go further than this second line?
Well, I can't see how one could make that kind of statement or give that kind of warning, because if they're in the midst of a fracas and they're rubbing shoulder by shoulder with the activists, it would be very difficult for the undercover officer to extract himself from that kind of scenario. It's almost inevitable. If he wanted to protect his identity, there might be a risk of his cover being blown. So there's a dichotomy here that he would be faced with. And I think it goes with the territory. There's an inherent risk that they may get arrested, but we can't expect them to be out there and sort of trying to avoid not participating full-heartedly with what his comrades are doing in the group. So it's a difficult dilemma.
But does that dilemma apply in your mind if the officers, comrades in the group, are planning a criminal damage attack, for example? Or does that only apply for an impromptu demonstration?
Impromptu demonstration, yeah.
So there's a distinction to be drawn in your mind
Yes.
between that sort of situation that arises somewhat unexpectedly,
Sure.
a demonstration that starts to get disorderly, for example, and a planned criminal activity,
Yes.
like a planned criminal damage attack. Is that fair?
I make that distinction, yes.
And so the question really is, how was an officer to know that their boss considered it okay for them to keep their cover if a situation arose impromptu, unexpectedly, but not to engage in planning, for example, a criminal damage attack?
Yes, it is. Once again, it is a dilemma. They have to live by their wits. Once again, it's perhaps easy to, in hindsight, to state that something should be done to prevent this from happening. But I suppose they get caught up in the events and the momentum of the actions that have been taken, whether it's a leafleting or whether it's a minor criminal damage. I can't see how one could avoid it.
If we can have a look at another part of your witness statement, please. Page 162, paragraph 280. And you acknowledge there that there were different levels of risk of arrest attaching to different types of deployment. And you say that the officers would have been advised accordingly at the start of their deployment.
Yes.
Did you identify deployments into animal rights groups and related groups, so the type of deployment that Bob Lambert had, as coming with a higher risk of arrest, or not?
Yes, I think it's true to say that there was that higher risk.
And when you say that the officer would have been advised accordingly, do you simply mean that you might have told somebody like John Dines, who was about to deploy into the animal rights field when you were in the unit, your deployment's going to come with a higher risk of arrest, or would you have given him any additional advice about what to do?
I think we would have explained to him what the hazards are, what the risks are.
And how he should respond if he found himself in that situation? Would that have been discussed with him?
Yeah, well, it ought to have been.
Do you have any recollection of discussing it with John Dines?
Not after this length of time.
Or HN87, who also deployed into that field?
No, that kind of minutiae I just cannot recollect.
You say elsewhere in your statement that you think that there was some advice given about what to do if an undercover officer was arrested. You thought that the folder in the back office, the binder, might have included instructions. Do you recall that now?
I can remember obviously the folder in the back office. Frankly, I can't remember. It may have been in the folder, but I cannot honestly remember if that was in the folder.
But it was certainly contemplated that officers might be arrested.
Yes.
And were they given guidance about what to do in the event of an arrest?
Well, there's not much they can do other than get a phone call into the back office staff, who are always aware in advance when there's any action or demonstration taking place, to provide support from the office in the event of them getting arrested by uniformed police.
Was your expectation that an officer arrested would maintain their cover even to the arresting police officers?
The arresting police officers wouldn't be aware.
So they would be misled as to the identity of the person
Yes.
they were arresting?
Yes.
Did that trouble you at all?
No.
Why not?
Well, if their identity is exposed, they go to a lot of money training these undercover officers to do the job they're doing. That would necessitate in the officer being withdrawn if there was a risk to his identity being disclosed.
And if the officer were to go on to be charged with a criminal offence and be called to appear before a court, would you expect the officer to maintain their cover identity before a court?
The answer to that is I don't think they should. The court should be aware of the true identity of the officer.
And
we
why?
We would just have to manage that as best we can.
And why the difference between the attitude toward misleading the arresting officers as to the identity of the person arrested and misleading the court as to the identity of the person appearing before it?
Well, if that information was, as I say, disclosed, there is a possible risk that his undercover identity might be uncovered.
But is that because the police are inherently less trustworthy and might give away his identity, whereas the court wouldn't, or for some other reason?
Well, not deliberately, so it's possible to me.
But when it came to the court, your view was that their real identity should be made known to the court?
Yes.
Can I ask you about a specific arrest that happened whilst you were in post? You didn't deal with it directly, Eric Docker did, but there are documents about it. It's the arrest of Robert Lambert at a hunt saboteur event in Crawley and Horsham. The document is MPS 0526789. It's your B9C, sir. And this is March 1987, whilst you were in post. We see from this document that Eric Docker went along and was in attendance for the purposes of the arrest. Do you recall being aware of Robert Lambert attending a mass hunt saboteur event, so a big hunt saboteur event, where the risk of arrest might arise?
I wasn't aware of that particular event.
Would the reason for Eric Docker attending be because the risk of arrest was anticipated by at least one of you?
Well, yes. I mean, there's always going to be that risk, particularly with the hunt saboteurs. There's always the risk of a fracas occurring and the officer being arrested.
Could we have a look, please, at page 5 of this document? It's a report drafted by Eric Docker following Robert Lambert's arrest. Sorry, could we just, so to help the witness orientate himself, could we just look at the previous page? Sorry, my fault. Right, so Mr. MacLeod, we see the subject heading of this is Arrest of an SDS Officer, DSR Lambert, and it's a report written dated the 3rd of March 1987, which is recording Robert Lambert's arrest, in fact, on the 28th of February. Do you see in paragraph 1? Whilst taking part in an anti-hunt demonstration at Horsham, Sussex.
Yes.
And then Mr. Docker sets out the circumstances of the arrest. Paragraph 3, I'll just summarise. About 180 demonstrators. It's recorded that they penetrated the police net in the area. they were shepherded en masse by police, encountered another roadblock, and decamped from vehicles into the surrounding fields. And then paragraph 4 records Detective Sergeant Lambert was therefore left no alternative but to follow his fellow activists, who were all chased by uniformed police officers. The majority escaped, but the officer, along with 7 others, was caught and arrested. And then all those arrested were taken to Horsham Police Station and interviewed. However, it soon became apparent that most of those arrested, including D.S. Lambert, had not committed any substantive offence, and therefore, after about 2 hours in police custody, Detective Sergeant Lambert was released without charge. So arrested, interviewed, but released without charge. Mr. Docker goes on to say at paragraph 7, over the page, this: although the arrest of an SDS officer is always an unwelcome experience, I consider that on this occasion the matter has proved beneficial. DS Lambert's standing within his group has been enhanced. Further useful intelligence has been obtained, and above all, our operation has not been compromised in any way at all. Do you agree with the sentiment expressed there that the arrest of an SDS officer was always an unwelcome experience?
Yes.
And why so?
Well, it's unwelcome. It's unpleasant for the officer himself being in that situation, being a serving police officer, being arrested. It doesn't come as a natural thing for a police officer to do. So it's just a difficult situation to be in, this kind of moral dilemma.
Any sense that it was undesirable as a starting point for a police officer to be involved in activity that might justify arrest?
The whole point of them doing what they're doing is to obtain that intelligence. With it, they carry inherent risks of arrest, so it's an occupational hazard, as far as I can see.
Mr. Docker's assessment there is that on this occasion, in fact, the arrest was beneficial and that the officer's standing within his group had been enhanced. How significant a factor was it to you, managing the unit, that an arrest might in fact enhance an officer's standing in the group?
Well, that's to the good of the actual operation.
Was it ever considered, in fact, beneficial generally for the officers to be arrested? So rather than trying to avoid it unless you have no other option, in fact, was it regarded as something beneficial for the officers to be arrested?
I don't think, if you're suggesting to put themselves in harm's way of getting arrested, I don't think they would do that. I think it would be, in the unfortunate event of them being arrested, it's beneficial in the sense, in the eyes of the activists.
But did that ever influence the management approach, in your experience, towards thinking that rather than being best avoided, arrest was something that the officers would benefit the officers in terms of enhancing their cover?
I can't say that they shouldn't actually be seeking to improve their image within the group by getting themselves arrested. That wouldn't be desirable at all. But if they accidentally get swept up in the fracas, then yes, there would be that benefit in terms of his status in the group being recognised.
So an incidental benefit rather than an aim.
Correct.
In the animal rights field in particular, did there ever come a time when you were on the unit when it was regarded as essential or important for an undercover officer to involve themselves in criminal activity to further their deployment?
No, that could not be encouraged at all. It should be avoided at all costs.
Was there not a dilemma in the animal rights field in this sense, that the purpose of a deployment into animal rights groups was primarily to get close to people who were committing crime in the name of animal rights, wasn't it?
Correct.
So to that extent, the deployment came closer to an evidential type of deployment than an intelligence gathering deployment. Would that be fair?
There is a risk of that happening, yes.
And in order for an undercover officer to get close enough to those committing the crime to be able to provide the intelligence about those crimes, was there not pressure for an officer themselves to be involved in criminal activity?
Well, from my recollection, and I'm quite clear on this, they were aware of the provisions of agent provocateur, and they would not be encouraged to take this one step further. They would be crossing the line between what's acceptable and what is not.
All right. Agent provocateur, the concept, the purpose of it is that a police officer shouldn't provoke or encourage another person to commit crime.
Yes.
Correct. My question is really aimed at whether or not an officer might involve themselves in criminal activity. So not encouraging or provoking anybody else necessarily, but showing themselves willing to commit crime in order to get close to the criminals.
As long as this action is not breaking the law, but just being in the vicinity of the offenders, of the activists, that would, in a sense, enhance his standing in the group. But it doesn't mean to say that justifies him participating in what would be considered a criminal offence, and therefore agent provocateur. They fully understood the provisions of that legislation, and I would expect them to
involving themselves in criminal acts as part of their deployment, other than where they got caught up unexpectedly.
Other than where they got caught up unexpectedly. I wouldn't encourage them to go that far. That is just a step too far.
It presented an officer in the animal rights field with a dilemma, though, didn't it?
Of course it did, yes.
If they wanted to get close to the intelligence about those committing criminal acts, standing always by the side might mean they never got there, mightn't it?
Well, that's up to them and how they actually manage that situation. It's a tricky situation as to how far they can go before breaching that line of criminality. If they are to observe, they can still observe from not necessarily the margins, but they don't necessarily have to put themselves in a vulnerable position where they are going to get arrested. So they've got to have their wits about them.
If we could have a look at something you said to Operation Sparkler. So you spoke to Operation Hearn in 2012, and then Operation Sparkler, which was looking into the Debenhams devices, came to speak to you a bit later in 2016-17. And could we please have on screen MPS 0736 832. It's your A5, sir. And these are the notes that Sparkler officers took having had a conversation with you. Sorry, that's my error. In fact, we better do this. It's better to do this through your witness statement. I'm sorry, that's my error. Can we have up on screen page 195 of your inquiry witness statement, paragraph 339? Because you were asked about this when you gave your witness statement. Right, starting at the bottom of that page and going over to the next page, please. All right, you say this in your witness statement by reference to those notes. In an Operation Sparkler interview from 2017-18, I say that he, that's Lambert, could not have known about the incident, that's Debenhams, in advance, because of these small cells, which he could not have got into. This remains my view for all the reasons I gave then. To summarise those reasons, it would be entirely out of character for him, and it would carry an enormous risk with no conceivable benefit. I want to ask about the first part of that paragraph. Your view that in relation to the Debenhams incidents, Robert Lambert could not have known in advance because of the small cells. It's right, isn't it, that certainly in the era when you were within the SDS, criminal action carried out in the name of the ALF was often carried out by small cells of individuals acting apart from the wider group or the wider activists.
That's my understanding.
And that cell structure was often, was it not, such that those outside the cell didn't seem to know much, if anything at all, about intended serious criminal action, certainly.
That certainly appears to be the case.
And so for an officer like Lambert, not being part of a cell at any stage would make it very difficult for him to obtain intelligence about serious criminal activity, wouldn't it?
I would say so, yes.
Did you discuss at any stage with Robert Lambert that dilemma that was presented to him, how he would go about getting intelligence on serious criminal activity without himself becoming part of an ALF cell?
No, I didn't.
Did he ever raise it with you as a dilemma?
No, not that I remember, not at all. In fact, I can be quite clear on that. It wasn't raised at all, no.
Did you at any stage have a discussion with him about what methods he was using to go about obtaining intelligence about serious ALF activity?
No, I didn't.
Did you have any understanding of what officers like Robert Lambert deployed into the animal rights groups or sphere were doing generally to get close to activists who were deemed ALF activists, so willing to or committing crimes?
No, that level of information, no.
Did it ever concern you what they might be doing, what Robert Lambert might be doing to get close to intelligence about ALF activity?
No. His role, after all, is to obtain intelligence and to prevent crime.
But I'm asking about your consideration of the methods he might have been using to obtain that intelligence.
I don't have an answer to that. I don't know.
Could we have up on screen another paragraph of your witness statement, please? It's page 202, 351C. It's still the section of your witness statement concerning Debenhams. Page 202, 351C. I want to ask you about the final two sentences of this. I'll come back to the detail later this morning, Mr. MacLeod, but you said this: I have been asked whether any thought was given at this stage, that's after the Debenhams devices had gone off, as to how Lambert would be able to obtain such intelligence, that is, intelligence about forthcoming attacks, if he was not within the small cell described in an intelligence report. And then you say this, his tasking was precisely to insinuate himself as close as possible to the cell. So did there come a time when you, or perhaps Eric Docker, or both of you, tasked Robert Lambert to get as close to as possible to an ALF cell?
To get as close as possible, that doesn't mean to say actually participating.
How did you envisage Robert Lambert might get close to a cell without, at the very least, presenting himself as somebody willing to participate in its activities?
Well, he was obviously very active and prominent within the London Greenpeace, and he's the type of individual who, personality, he was obviously popular in his target group. That information might have been obtained in casual conversations he might have had with his activist friends.
But wasn't the point of the ALF cell structure that they weren't having casual conversations with a wide group about intended or already committed serious criminal activity? They were keeping it within the cell, weren't they?
Yes, very likely. And but of course we don't know to what extent this may have been discussed beyond the actual cell itself, where Bob Lambert could have picked it up.
Are you quite... Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, sorry.
Are you quite sure that it was never contemplated that Bob Lambert might himself become part of an ALF cell in order to gain intelligence on serious criminal activity?
Well, we knew that he was close to the cell, but beyond that, whether or not there was participation, we don't know. I don't know, and there was nothing to suggest that that was going to happen. But clearly, yes, he was privy to what was going on within the cell, but to what extent, I would be hazarding a guess.
I'll come back to the detail of his participation or otherwise shortly. Can I ask you first, before I do that, about a document that postdates your time in the SDS? It's MPS 0730597. And it's from 1993, so it's several years after you left. It's a document that was drafted within the SDS. Can we turn through the pages, please, just to the next page, just so you can see the first page there. We've got a contents, sorry, don't zoom in, thank you. We've got the date, the 15th of January 1993. There are a number of contents listed to the document, including at 3 policy guidelines regarding participation in crime. And if we could turn, please, to page 16, where that is dealt with. The document, I'll read these 2 paragraphs for you, Mr. MacLeod, 3.8 and 3.9. The document says this about the SDS. Since those early years, arrests have been relatively few, and it is to the credit of the officers involved that on many occasions where involvement in crime was proffered, excuses have been found to avoid involvement in the actual event. The higher risk fields for involvement in crime are anti-fascist activity, anarchism, and animal rights. In the last mentioned field, so that is animal rights, in order to gain full acceptance and trust, participation in illegal activities is essential. When you were in charge of the SDS, as its Detective Chief Inspector, did you regard that participation in illegal activities in the animal rights field was in fact essential?
If his participation in illegal activities, which might result in serious harm or damage being done, if it was in danger of a serious offence, then it's a question of deciding just how close you may have got or been encouraged to get to in identifying the people responsible. So it's again another moral dilemma as to whether or not these decisions, it's a very fine line.
So did you or did you not regard participation in illegal activity as essential for an officer in the animal rights field?
Again, if you want to weigh it up with on balance, what it may achieve in preventing loss of life or injury to people or serious damage, it's the lesser of two evils.
So you're saying there are circumstances in which you might have balanced considerations and come to the conclusion that it was in fact essential?
Well, clearly, that's what I said there. And
I don't want to confuse you. I'm asking for your view at the time you were the Detective Chief Inspector. Is that the approach that you took to illegal activity by undercover officers in the animal rights field?
Well, I have to stand by that, yes.
This is a document that post-dates your time. This is not your document. Does that make any difference to your answer?
I think we're on the same wavelength, whoever wrote that. I can't disagree.
The document goes on to say this level is progressive from inspections of premises where no criminal offences are actually committed, through the housing of liberated animals, daubing and other minor damage to premises, through to product contamination, arson, and the use of improvised explosive devices. So the document appears to contemplate, doesn't it, that officers might be involved in anything from an inspection where no criminal offences are actually committed, all the way up to arson and the use of improvised explosive devices.
Yes.
Did you consider that there were circumstances in which an officer might be authorised to commit an offence as serious as arson?
No, I draw the line at that.
Where in that progressive list set out there would you draw the line? Only at arson? Would everything else be below that be considered potentially permissible?
Well, apart from just the arson and use of improvised devices. And clearly a threat to individuals, a threat to life. I think I would support that.
What about arson that was intended only to cause damage to property? Would that be potentially permissible?
If that was the aim, no, that's not acceptable. That's crossing the line, in my opinion.
All right. With that in mind, can I turn to ask you some detailed questions about Robert Lambert's deployment? Starting with events in November of 1986, when you were new to the unit, to the SDS. Could we have a look, please, at an intelligence report, MPS 0742726? It's your B5A, sir. And can we turn to the body of the intelligence report? It's signed off by Mr. Docker, not by you, so that's clear, Mr. MacLeod. And if we can zoom in on paragraph 2, this report actually dated the 2nd of December, but it's reporting events on the 28th of November 1986. And it says this: ALF, Animal Liberation Front activists in North London carried out an attack on a vehicle belonging to a Biorex vivisector parked outside the company's laboratory in Canonbury Villas N1 when the car's bodywork was attacked with paint stripper. The vehicle concerned is understood to be a Ford Granada saloon with a distinctive number plate featuring the initials SG, which was mentioned as a likely target in an earlier report. Do you have any independent recollection of what's reported here?
None whatsoever.
The inquiry has received evidence from former activists, suggesting that this attack was in fact carried out by Robert Lambert. Did that ever come to your attention?
No, it certainly did not. This is the first I've heard of it.
This would be in the list of potential criminal activities we saw in the document a moment ago, a criminal damage attack, less serious than arson, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Is it possible that Robert Lambert might have been authorised to commit an act like this?
Well, he shouldn't have been.
Might he have been in order to ingratiate himself with those activists who were prepared to commit criminal offences in the name of the ALF?
No, I don't think it's justified in these circumstances.
Have you any knowledge as to whether Robert Lambert, or any understanding as to whether Robert Lambert thought it appropriate to commit acts like this in order to ingratiate himself with those committing criminal acts in the name of the ALF?
Well, Robert Lambert is well familiar with the law and would know that that is going one step too far, in my view.
A moment ago, when we were looking at the document from 1993, your evidence was that it was possible that there were circumstances in which it would be considered justifiable for an undercover officer to commit such offences. So how would he know which side of the line this would fall on?
It is indeed a very fine line, I accept that. No, this is act of vandalism against property. I don't think it carries the same risk as, for example, planting an incendiary device or something of that like. I think we have to draw a line here, and I think we draw the line on that.
But what confidence do you have that Robert Lambert would have drawn the line in that place?
Well, there's no way of me knowing if he crosses that line. He ought to be aware that, and would have been aware that, that's a step too far.
But how would he have been aware of that?
Because
if you didn't discuss it with him?
He understands what the agent provocateur provisions are.
Agent provocateur is about encouraging or provoking others to commit crime, isn't it?
Yes.
This would be about him committing a crime as an undercover police officer. So agent provocateur doesn't necessarily help him, does it, that doctrine?
Well, if not, it should have done.
But how would the doctrine that's about provoking others to commit crime have helped Robert Lambert to decide whether or not he should commit a crime?
Well, He's a serving police officer. He should be mindful of the risks. Yes, we're almost splitting hairs here, but in actual fact, there is an inherent risk in taking this step too far on property as to compared with where there's a more likelihood of harm being caused to human life, as we mentioned earlier.
So possible that Robert Lambert might have seen fit to commit this sort of act, and you wouldn't have known about it?
No, I wouldn't have known about it. In fact, this is the first I've become aware of this. Of course, it's outside my time period anyway.
Well, you joined the SDS as its Detective Chief Inspector in November of 1986.
Yes.
So by the date of this report on the 2nd of December, you were the Detective Chief Inspector in the
right.
unit.
Okay. No, I hadn't seen this before. Conversation.
Could we take that down, please, and turn to a report on the 9th of June of 1987, MPS 0740088. It's your B13A, sir. And can we turn to the body of the report, please? And Mr. MacLeod, so that it's clear to you, this is another report signed by Mr. Docker, not signed off by you. And can we zoom in on the first paragraph to begin with, please? I'll read it into the record for you, Mr. MacLeod. Between the 6th of January 1985 and the 20th of May this year, 46 incendiary device attacks were carried out by members of the ALF and other extreme elements within the animal rights movement against targets deemed to be involved in animal abuse. None of the actions has resulted in injury to any person. Instead, substantial financial loss has been sustained, mainly by the meat and fur trade. The following information concerning the future of this campaign of economic sabotage has been received from a secret and reliable source. Paragraph 2, please. Details emanating from recent secret meetings between leading ALF activists in Manchester, Coventry and London strongly suggest that the manufacture and use of timed incendiary devices will continue throughout 1987. It is also clear that the 11 actions carried out so far this year are all the responsibility of the ALF, even though they have not all been claimed, and one was claimed by the Vermin Liberation Front. Future actions will apparently follow the familiar pattern of attacks on department stores selling furs, brackets, incendiaries which are intended to activate the sprinkler system inside stores and cause damage by flooding, and on meat trade depots / lorries / offices, brackets, incendiaries intended to ignite petrol tanks on vehicles or otherwise cause damage by fire. So far, actions have taken place outside the Metropolitan Police District, although it now seems certain that London will be included in this year's campaign. Mr. Lambert has given evidence that he was at one of those secret meetings in Manchester. Were you aware that he was attending that sort of meeting by June 1987?
No, I wasn't aware.
Does it cause you any concern that he was?
No.
Would you have been discussing with Mr. Lambert, for example, at the weekly meetings, where he was going and what he was doing?
I would have been.
Do you recall reporting from him to this effect, that London, it seems certain that London will be included in this year's campaign, that campaign being the use of timed incendiary devices, including in department stores selling furs?
I'm sure if he had told me that, I would have remembered it.
Well, is this the sort of report, the significance of which you would expect to have been flagged to you for your attention?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Do you have any recollection of that happening?
No, I don't.
This is quite important intelligence for the Metropolitan Police Service, isn't it? That the
Absolutely.
ALF incendiary device campaign
Absolutely.
is coming to London.
Yeah.
And you would want, presumably, for this intelligence to be disseminated so that the rest of the service could prepare itself for the possibility of an IID attack,
Yes.
potentially in a department store selling furs in London. What assessment, if any, did you make at around this time as to whether Robert Lambert was appropriately or inappropriately close to those who appear to have been contemplating such attacks?
When their field officers are expected to use their initiative, once again, we have to allow a certain degree of latitude. They are mature officers, they know what they're doing. I would have expected something like that to have been brought to our attention, but I frankly wasn't aware of it, unless Eric Docker was, but I certainly can't recall this.
Might you have considered that Robert Lambert might himself have felt under pressure to obtain more intelligence about the possibility of attacks in London?
No undercover officer should feel, as you say, under pressure, because that suggests that he might go above and beyond what is legally acceptable. So, yeah.
And did you take any steps to guard against officers like Robert Lambert feeling the need to go above and beyond what was acceptable?
No, I mean, that's not something you expect to do. And you, as I said before, I mean, he was a very successful officer. He's a very intelligent man. I would expect him to use common sense in his decision making when it comes to this.
Looking back now, knowing what you know about how he did conduct himself, particularly in regard to Jackie and the fathering of a son, do you retain any confidence that he was able to appropriately exercise common sense when making judgments about what was and wasn't appropriate in an undercover role?
Well, you've said it all. It's just totally and utterly unacceptable.
Does that cause you to reflect about whether he knew where to draw the line when it came to participation in criminal activity?
I'm not sure you can compare the two. These are moral judgments only he could make. I don't think we can conflate the two between the illicit relationship with this lady and the planting of devices. No, there's a kind of dichotomy there between the two.
All right, so just because he'd sailed way beyond the line in terms of his interactions with women whilst undercover, you don't consider that makes him more likely to have sailed across the line in terms of what was permissible with criminal activity?
No, I don't think you can conflate the two.
Could we have a look at paragraph 5 of this report, please? Sorry, we have to go over a number of pages. Mr. MacLeod, there's a section of the report setting out various details about how incendiary devices are constructed. And then paragraph 5 says this: recent arrests and charges made in connection with devices planted in department stores in South Wales earlier this year have reminded activists that police inquiries into these matters tend to be thorough. Equally, after the trial of Lee, Smith, Roger Yates and others at Sheffield Crown Court earlier this year, they are under no illusions about the level of sentencing to expect in the event of a subsequent conviction. And here's the part I particularly want to ask you about. It starts accordingly. Accordingly, the use of incendiary devices is restricted to the most dedicated activists, who are forced to observe strict security even amongst their comrades in the animal rights movement. Such activists always pay due regard to the prospect of surveillance and infiltration, even though they may not always be expert at countering it. This presented a significant challenge to an officer like Lambert, didn't it? Activists were particularly strictly security aware
Yes.
at this stage in time.
Correct.
Do you remember being aware of that at the time?
No, I don't. I can't recall any of this.
Any discussion at all with Lambert about what approach he might take to keep tabs on the potential use of incendiary devices in London in the summer of 1987?
No. And unless he shared that with Eric, again, as I say, I mean, this is the first time I've been made aware of this.
If he had shared that information with Eric Docker, your detective inspector, would you not have expected Eric Docker to have shared it with you, given the significance of this intelligence?
I'm sure if he had that information, that he would have passed it on to me. So it makes me, it suggests that he probably was not aware either.
So not aware of the methods that Lambert
Yes.
was adopting?
Yeah.
This report is dated the 9th of June of 1987. And we know that the incendiary devices in various Debenham stores went off overnight from the 11th to the 12th of July 1987, so about a month, just in excess of a month after this report.
Yeah.
The inquiry has been able to locate no further reporting about IID attacks after this report and before the Debenhams IIDs went off. Do you follow? So in that month or so, an absence of any reporting from the SDS based on what the inquiry's been able to find. Do you remember at the time noticing an absence of further reporting from Lambert about this significant matter?
No, I can't, other than to say that he was quite a prolific reporter. His intelligence was invariably good. So no, I don't think there's anything I can add to that.
So an absence of reporting might have been particularly noticeable from a prolific reporter like Lambert, might it not?
Yes, I accept.
But you don't recall noticing that at the time?
No, not at all.
Does it strike you now as odd that Robert Lambert might not have reported anything more about the incendiary device campaign between the 9th of June and the setting off of IIDs in Debenhams around London in July?
Well, all I can say is I hadn't previously seen this, so I can only speak for myself. But I accept the position you're talking about. But no, I was never aware of this.
When you said a moment ago that Mr. Lambert's intelligence was good, generally, how did you measure whether or not his intelligence was good or not?
Well, if you create it, was it moderate? Was it accurate? We have to accept that that was his judgment, his opinion. that he's gleaned from the people that he's working in the within the target group. All I can say was there were regular reports from Bob Lambert, and there was nothing in any of them that would make us question the sort of validity of that. And if there was, if he did have this information that wasn't shared, I mean, that's just unfortunate. We should have been aware of this.
In terms of being able to assess the accuracy of his reporting, were you really in a position to do that? So I'll take an example. If Mr. Lambert reported that person X was at a meeting in London on a particular day, but in fact person X was out of London on that day, you wouldn't have known that necessarily, would you?
No.
So it could be inaccurate in reporting that person X was at a meeting in London, and you wouldn't be able to judge that?
No, I accept that.
So in terms of its accuracy, you were heavily dependent, in the absence of some other information to check it against. You were heavily dependent on Robert Lambert's accuracy, weren't you?
Yes.
Could we have a look, please, at your witness statement, page 187, paragraph 327D? In your witness statement, Mr. MacLeod, you said that there were no changes in the pattern and focus of Lambert's reporting in the 6 months preceding the Debenhams attack, such that I had reason to doubt whether he was reporting all of the information or intelligence that he obtained during this period. I would point out that in paragraph 6 of his report dated the 9th of June 1987, that's the one we've just looked at, he promises to report any planned attacks. I would have had faith that he would do so. Do you stand by that paragraph of your witness statement? I
have no reason to question that otherwise.
So you don't recall noticing any change in the pattern? So does that mean include the frequency of his reporting?
I guess the frequency, but...
So he continued to put in intelligence reports in such a way that you didn't notice any change?
That would appear to be the case.
And you say you would have had faith that he would have reported the planned attacks. Did he in fact report the planned attacks to you in any format before they happened?
No.
Can we have a look at paragraph 327A, just on the previous page? I just want to clarify this with you, Mr. MacLeod. Paragraph A reads as follows. He provided intelligence about the campaign that was not written down. There would have been additional oral communication at meetings. Hot intelligence would have been recorded in one-to-one meetings. It would most certainly have been documented. Could you clarify whether you received intelligence about the IID campaign from Mr. Lambert that was not written down?
No.
No, you did not receive?
No, I did not receive.
So it's more accurate in the final sentence where it says it would most certainly have been documented?
Yeah.
So to the extent that you received oral reporting from Mr. Lambert, you would have ensured that that was committed to a written intelligence report?
Yes.
If it was about something as significant as an IID campaign?
Yes. Yeah.
Were you receiving reports orally from Mr. Lambert at around this time, can you remember, concerning the IID campaign?
To the best of my recollection, no.
But you have confidence that if you were, that would have found its way into an intelligence report?
I would have expected it to, yes.
And bearing all of that in mind, can you think of any reason why the inquiry has been unable to find on special branch files any written reporting from Mr. Lambert about the IID campaign between the 9th of June and the 11th of July of 1987?
I can't explain that.
Mr. Docker, when he gave evidence, suggested that Bob Lambert might have been so busy gathering intelligence that he simply didn't submit reports during that period. Do you have any view on whether that's a plausible explanation?
No, I don't.
Is it possible that he might have been so busy that he didn't submit reports on an IID campaign coming to London?
I find that highly unlikely. I would have expected there to have been some written reports of that intelligence. I would have expected it.
When Robert Lambert gave evidence on the 6th of December last year, he recalled having regular meetings with his managers between the 9th of June report and the IIDs going off in July. Is he right about that? Regular meetings with you or Mr. Docker or both of you?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I can't remember that being the case. I think had it been the case, I would have been more aware. But I truthfully never, I wasn't aware of that.
He also told the inquiry on the same day that far from every discussion he had with his managers resulted in a written intelligence report. So suggesting that there would have been conversations that did not in fact result in a written intelligence report. Again, is that something you consider likely?
I would have thought if he's got time to write an intelligence report, it wouldn't be in the form of a manuscript. It would be a properly written intelligence report.
So I think Mr. Lambert was suggesting that he might have conveyed information orally that didn't find its way into any sort of written or printed report concerning this campaign.
Yes, well, it would be he who would be submitting it.
So you would have relied on him to complete the report?
Well, of course, yes.
Did Mr. Lambert, do you recall, ever mention meeting with activists in parks in the run-up to the incendiary device attacks on Debenhams, including Jeff Shepherd?
Meetings in parks?
Meetings in parks, yep, discussions in parks in the run-up.
Never heard of that.
In your witness statement, you said that you would not be in the least bit surprised if Mr. Lambert was meeting Mr. Shepherd regularly. In general, you would expect him to be meeting them. I'll bring it up on the screen. It's page 185, please, paragraph 326. So you were provided when making your witness statement with earlier accounts from Mr. Shepherd, from Jeff Shepherd, which included him recalling some of the meetings I had with Bob Lambert in the period before July 1987 were one-to-one, and some were part of a larger group. The meetings were ad hoc in structure and I would generally listen more than talk. The meetings began against a background of a wider campaign against stores which had furs for sale in them, and other options would have certainly been considered before the decision was made to target Debenhams in that particular way. But that particular plan became the focus, and no other direct action arose out of these meetings. He also refers to meeting Bob Lambert in a park, by which point decisions had been made to use incendiary devices to target Debenhams and who would make the devices, and further meetings followed, including to discuss targets. So that's Mr. Shepherd's account of what was going on. And you said this: "I have no doubt I was aware at the time of Bob Lambert meeting Mr. Shepherd regularly on an individual basis and or in a number of different locations. I am not in the least bit surprised by it, as I would expect him to be meeting targets, and particularly those suspected to be in an ALF cell. It was part and parcel of his role. It is likely I found out through discussions at weekly meetings." And then you go on to say, "I took no action in response to this information." So you would not have been surprised if Mr. Lambert was meeting in the run-up to the Debenhams attacks with somebody who formed part of the cell who carried out those attacks. Is that fair?
That would appear to be right. Yes, I agree.
Meeting with a member of the cell to discuss forthcoming attacks would indicate that Mr. Lambert was possibly, at least, part of that cell, wouldn't it?
He was certainly close to the centre.
And that caused you no concern at all in terms of his involvement in planning for or committing criminal acts?
No, there's nothing to suggest he would take that step too far beyond obtaining the information that potentially there might be further attacks, incendiary attacks.
If he was attending meetings at which those attacks were being planned, so for example the selection of which stores would be targeted was under discussion, would that cause you concern?
Had I known about it, yes, of course.
But you weren't told about that at the time by Mr. Lambert?
No.
Do you recall whether Bob Lambert mentioned Helen Steele at any stage in connection with the attacks prior to the devices going off in Debenhams?
No. Not to the best of my recollection, no.
And Paul Gravett?
The same.
Could we have a look, please, at paragraph 331 of your statement, page 191? And in this paragraph, Mr. MacLeod, you're responding to something that Bob Lambert said when he was interviewed by officers from Operation Hearn. Right. So when you say in the same interview, I am told he said, you're referring to Robert Lambert. In the same interview, I'm told he said, what really interested me was knowing that my friends on the surveillance team were on the case as well. If I'm going to the pub with that group, Paul Gravett, Jeff Shepherd, Helen Steele, Andrew Clark, I would see the surveillance team, and they had exactly the same interest leading up to the attacks that took place. In the 2 months leading up to that, there's a lot of special branch activity on this campaign. And you said this in response: as to this, I find it hard to believe the surveillance team were deployed for 2 entire months before July, if that is what Lambert meant to say, which is not clear. I base this view on my S-Squad experience. And then you mentioned that you can see from documents that they were deployed after the July attacks based on information from Mr. Lambert. Could I just explore with you, putting to one side whether they were deployed for 2 whole months in advance of the July attacks or not, are you able to say whether there was surveillance going on this group of people, including Bob Lambert, in advance of the July attacks?
I can't say with any certainty, but having run the surveillance team previously for 3 years, I'm was acutely aware of the competing demands on the surveillance team from the other squads within Special Branch. That one should have spent that length of time. It's possible, but it's possible that that was the length of time that they did spend on it, but it seems an inordinately a lot of man hours spent on putting surveillance on these individuals, unless there was hot intelligence that something was going to go up, and in which case you would have deployed the surveillance team to that, with a view to arresting or thwarting any planned attacks.
Right, so the purpose of deploying the surveillance team would be either to help to effect an arrest before anything happened,
Yes.
or somehow to thwart the plan.
Yes.
You wouldn't expect them simply to be surveilling Bob Robinson as he was and his friends in the pub for the 2 months prior to the attacks.
From my experience, I find that slightly implausible.
Were you made aware at any stage of surveillance going on in that period that had captured Bob Robinson, Bob Lambert?
I can't remember because the surveillance team was run separately, and I wouldn't have been aware of the targets that they were dealing with at that time.
Even if one of your undercover officers was perceived as a target, would you expect to be made aware of that?
Well, clearly he was, on this one occasion, it appears that the surveillance team had been deployed. And I mean, if it's getting close to a possible attack being carried out, yes, you would expect us to deploy surveillance. And it may have just been of short duration, but the suggestion that was deployed for 2 entire months, it just, as I say, it's possible, but in my experience, I think that's a slight exaggeration, because I know exactly how difficult it is to find manpower for other operations that were happening in Special Branch.
You had an undercover officer who, on the 9th of June, had reported that the IID campaign was coming to London. We've seen that in the 9th of June report, and that was Bob Lambert, wasn't it?
Yes.
And in the SDS, he was your source, the one source, as far as you were concerned, who was in a position to report on what might come next. Yep. And he, based on your evidence and your recollection, he provided no advance warning that there would be incendiary device attacks in branches of Debenhams. Is that right?
Yes.
No advance intelligence to suggest that the 11th to the 12th of July would be the date when incendiary device attacks would be carried out. No intelligence to suggest that it would be stores in Luton, Harrow and Romford that would be the subject of attacks. So, based on SDS intelligence alone, the surveillance team wouldn't have had enough information to go on, would they?
Correct.
You say elsewhere in your witness statement, the next paragraph, that you were not part of a discussion about any coordinated approach with Special Branch, with surveillance, so you weren't involved in any discussions of that nature.
No, I wasn't, but Eric could have been, which is quite likely, but no, I wasn't.
The inquiry has received evidence from Paul Gravett that on the 13th of June 1987, so 4 days after the report we looked at, a benefit gig was held in Slough, which he helped to organise and which raised funds that were used in part to fund the Debenhams IIDs. Do you follow? So a money-raising event in Slough on the 13th of June. And his evidence is that Bob Robinson, Bob Lambert, helped to arrange that fundraising event. Did Bob Lambert ever discuss with you being involved in raising funds for the ALF?
No.
Did he discuss with you a fundraising event in June 1987?
No.
if he was involved in arranging such an event, would you expect him to have submitted a report of some kind about it?
Yes.
And did he ever submit a report, orally or written, about involvement in that activity?
No.
What would your view have been if he had told you that he was involved in raising funds that were intended to go to ALF direct action?
Well, there's nothing actionable there. If the fundraising, as you would expect these organisations to do, there's nothing that would significantly guide management into taking any particular position. It would be recorded, but that would be as far as it went.
What about if the purpose to which the funds were going to be put was an IID campaign?
Yeah. Well, I hadn't been aware of that, but that's again no excuse. But thinking back, I wasn't aware of this event taking place.
Would you have approved or disapproved of an officer being involved in raising monies for use in carrying out an ALF incendiary device campaign?
I don't think I would have discouraged it. I think that's the kind of activity you expect an intelligence officer to be participating in. So I don't have a difficulty with that.
Finally, before I'm going to suggest we take the morning break, did Robert Lambert discuss with you at any stage reconnaissance visits to particular branches of Debenhams stores?
No, definitely not.
Either by him or by others?
No.
Thank you.
And we'll break for 15 minutes.
All right, so if we look at the content of the report, bearing in mind that it's signed off by Mr. Docker, not by you, we see in the... Can we focus on paragraphs 2 to 4, please? We see that by the 24th of July, paragraph 3, Andrew Clark appears to have made it known that he will continue to manufacture incendiary devices. And so Lambert is able to report that the manufacture is going to continue.
Yep.
And then at paragraph 4, it says this: Clark and his trusted comrades are agreed that Debenham should be given until the 1st of October 1987 to remove furs from all their stores. In the meantime, he plans to have devices ready for use against other retail outlets for the fur trade. Provisionally, it would appear that the most likely targets will be Harrods of Knightsbridge and C&A in Oxford Street, W1. So Lambert's in possession of information that Mr. Clark will continue to manufacture incendiary devices, and also about provisional targets for their use. Do you recall Mr. Lambert reporting such intelligence?
No, I don't.
Do you recall receiving or becoming aware of this intelligence about possible new targets?
No.
It would have been quite significant intelligence, wouldn't
Well,
it?
of course it would, but I'm just pondering as to whether or not I was still on my annual leave at the time, but something like this would have come across my desk, most certainly.
And even if you had been away as at the date of this report, it's likely to have come across your desk when you got back, isn't it?
Yes.
Something of this significance.
Yes, indeed.
Do you recall questioning how it was that Lambert was able to report, less than 2 weeks after the Debenhams attacks, that Mr. Clark was manufacturing devices for use at Harrods and C&A, potentially?
Yes, I guess, well, there was, at that point, there was no cause for me to question it. I suppose it was taken at face value.
Did it not seem surprising to you that an officer who appeared on the face of his reporting to have been entirely in the dark about which stores would be targeted on the 11th of July was two weeks later able to say which stores would be targeted in Mr. Clark's next intended attacks? Did that not strike you as surprising even at the time?
Yes, if I'd read that, if I'd seen this.
You don't recall discussing that with Mr. Lambert?
No, I don't.
Or with Eric Docker, for example,
No,
and saying, what do we think's going on?
No, we didn't have that conversation at all.
Any conversation, any query or reflection on who Clark and his trusted comrades were, who referred to in paragraph 4? Put another way, would you not have asked for the names of the trusted comrades, asked whether Lambert knew who they were?
If I'd seen this report.
Still no Jeff Shepherd named in this report
No,
anywhere?
I noticed that.
Do you have any recollection of discussing Jeff Shepherd as a suspect in connection with the Debenhams attacks within 2 weeks or so of the attacks occurring?
Yes, I think in the aftermath of the main attacks, there had been some discussion as to who the possible suspects were and what plans they may have for future attacks. But I can't right off the top of my head say who they were referring to. Clark. I can't remember, but there would have been a conversation.
if Mr. Lambert had reported orally to you that Jeff Shepherd should be regarded as a suspect in connection with Debenhams, is there any chance that wouldn't have been committed to writing?
No, I agree. I would expect that to be in written form.
So your deduction, and I accept it's a deduction rather than a recollection, would your deduction be that the absence of Mr. Shepherd's name is indicative of Mr. Shepherd's name not having been mentioned to you?
Yes.
Was Mr. Shepherd's name, or is it possible that Mr. Shepherd's name was mentioned to you not as a suspect, but as Mr. Lambert's source for the information, and that wasn't written down?
I mean, it's possible, but I can't recall, can't recollect. But it is possible.
If we can take that report down, bear in mind that's the 24th of July, this report that we've just looked at, which says Mr. Clark is going to continue to manufacture devices and provisionally most likely to target Harrods and C&A. If we take that down, please, can we have up MPS 0735358, your B19, sir? This is the same day, Mr. MacLeod, but it's a briefing note signed off by Chief Superintendent Short. And could we focus in on paragraphs 1 and 2, please? Right, so a briefing note that appears to be for the attention of Commander Ops. And Mr. Short's briefing note reads as follows at paragraph 1. We discussed the information contained in this latest S-Squad report on the activities of Andrew Clark, whom source has identified as being responsible for the manufacture of incendiary devices used in the recent attacks. We agreed to await developments and not search his and other activists' addresses until forensic examinations are complete and further investigations are made to establish a chain of evidence. So echoing the report, the note we saw of the 14th of July, awaiting further investigations before searching. Paragraph 2, this current information justifies that decision, particularly as Clark's intention is to find an empty house in North London to manufacture further devices. I am assured that the source should be in a position to establish that address at an early stage. Did you give an assurance that Bob Lambert would be able to identify the address selected by Mr. Clark for the manufacture of incendiary devices?
No.
Can you think who might have given that assurance to Mr. Short?
Well, whether it was Eric Docker or not, I don't know who else would have given that information.
Would it have been unusual or not for Mr. Lambert to have spoken directly to Mr. Short? Would you expect that to have happened?
That could have happened, yes.
All right, thank you. Could we take that down? That was the 24th of July, so just under 2 weeks after the devices had been used in Debenhams. And can we have on the screen, please, MPS 0735360, now the 7th of August of 1987. So about 12 or 13 days later, almost 2 weeks later again. And this note, if we can focus on the typed information on the left, please, as we see it on the screen. Thank you. This note records a meeting on the 7th of August at which you are listed as an attendee. Do you see penultimate entry there in the list is your name, Detective Chief Inspector MacLeod.
Yep.
Along with individuals, Commander Phelan, Commander Churchill Coleman from SO13, Chief Superintendent Parker of S Squad, Chief Superintendent Short from C Squad, and a Detective Chief Inspector from Arnie. Now, you say in your witness statement you have no independent recollection of this meeting, is that right?
Correct.
So we'll be relying on the document to tell us what was happening. And we see here that it's been agreed that a surveillance operation would be mounted against Andrew Clark. And in paragraph 2, it is said one of the main objectives was to pinpoint the address where it is suggested he, that's Clark, intends to manufacture further incendiary devices. The previous briefing note we looked at suggested that Mr. Short had been given an assurance that Lambert would be in a position to identify that address. What we now appear to see is surveillance starting to help pinpoint the address. Do you remember discussions about the utility of surveillance versus the utility of Mr. Lambert in identifying Mr. Clark's activities?
Yes, I can remember discussions taking place, but I can't remember the content, but I do recall.
Was there any doubt about whether or not Robert Lambert would be in a position to provide intelligence about where Mr. Clark would manufacture devices?
I think they would have known.
He would have known.
Yeah, he would have known.
And why are you able to say that with any confidence?
Well, not with particular confidence. I would just... I'm not absolutely certain on that point.
Was the impression that you formed at the time from speaking to or communicating with Robert Lambert that he was confident that he would be able to find out that level of information?
Yes, he was, from my recollections. That is so.
He didn't leave you with any doubt that he would be able to provide the intelligence about Mr. Clark's plans for the future?
If I recall, I think he sounded quite confident.
Do you recall, at this stage, the extent to which Special Branch was involved in any investigative activity connected with the Debenhams attacks? So Special Branch as opposed to or as distinct from SO13?
No, the branch wouldn't undertake any investigations. The investigations would be carried out, I should say, by SO13. So the intelligence and the day-to-day workings of the anti-terrorist branch should be kept separate.
And are you saying that because that was the normal position, or because you recall that that's how it operated in connection with the Debenhams incidents in particular?
That was the normal position.
If we just look at this document, can we zoom in on paragraph 2 of the document, please? Thank you. About halfway down, you see Commander Churchill Coleman agreed. Do you see where that sentence begins?
Yes.
And Commander Churchill Coleman, he was SO13, wasn't he?
Yes.
He agreed that a small team under Detective Inspector Gray will be made available to make any follow-up evidential inquiries.
Yes.
Was Detective Inspector Gray attached to Special Branch or a Special Branch liaison officer with SO13?
The latter. He was a Special Branch officer assigned to SO13 as the liaison officer.
So to that extent, it appears that a Special Branch officer, the liaison officer with SO13,
Yeah.
was involved in making evidential inquiries with SO13.
Well, he wouldn't be making, he was the role of the inspector, the Special Branch inspector, in 1817 would be a conduit through to the senior management in the branch. He wouldn't have any proactive role in the actual execution of the investigations that SO13 be carrying out. He was purely a conduit for information feeding back into the branch.
But do you see this note appears to suggest that he's going to lead a team to make evidential inquiries?
Yes, he would have a team of SO13 officers. That would include forensic investigation officers. But his would be to oversee the actual. I can see where this could become confusing. He was an he was a special branch officer, and the officers who were accompanying him at the address would be SO13 officers.
Yes.
So there isn't a conflict there. It's the special branch conduit was D.I. Gray, and that would be done quite routinely to ensure that the information obtained from the searches go back into special branch and for the information of the operational squads, C squad and S squad.
So it doesn't strike you as unusual that the special branch liaison officer in SO13 would be leading a team making evidential inquiries?
I don't see any conflict there at all. That was the role.
That was normal for the role?
That was, yes.
Thank you. All right, could we take that document down, please? That's a meeting on the 7th of August that you attended, that we've just looked at.
Yes.
And could we have up on the screen, please, MPS 0735 383. It's your B24, sir. And Mr. MacLeod, this is an intelligence report dated the 11th of August, 1987. So 4 days after the meeting, and you signed this report.
Right.
And if we could look, please, first of all at paragraph 2. This is reporting that Clark has revealed more details of his involvement in the incendiary device attacks at Debenhams. In addition to manufacturing the devices, he claims to have been responsible for planting the devices at the Luton store, where damage in excess of £10 million was caused. So first reporting that we see that not only did Mr. Clark manufacture the devices, but that he is claiming to have been responsible for planting the devices at the Luton store. Do you agree that Mr. Lambert must have been quite close by now to Mr. Clark, or to Mr. Clark's associates at the very least, close associates, to know that he was claiming to have planted the devices in Luton?
Well, obviously he must have been very close in order to do that.
And did that cause you any concern about whether he was getting closer than was appropriate?
Not at the time, it didn't.
And now, do you have a different reflection?
No, there's nothing for me to suggest otherwise, given the length of time involved in this. My recollection tends to be a bit blurred, and not conveniently, but genuinely so. My recollection was just that Bob Lambert was in a position where he could obtain critical information. So the I can see where there could possibly be the conflict that you talk about. But that wouldn't have caused me any concerns.
Did you give any thought to what position Mr. Lambert must have been in vis-a-vis this cell to be obtaining intelligence like this?
Yes, he must have been close.
The report goes on at paragraph 2 to say 2 close and trusted comrades were responsible for planting devices at the Harrow and Romford branches. Their identity is not known at present. Again, did it cause you any surprise that Mr. Lambert was here on the 11th of August or thereabouts, able to say that Mr. Clark was responsible for planting one of the devices, or was claiming to be responsible, but he couldn't offer anything in relation to the Harrow or Romford devices? Was that surprising to you?
Yes, I guess it probably is a bit surprising.
This would have been quite significant information to the investigation, of course.
Yes, of course.
Who was responsible for planting them?
Yeah.
Do you recall discussions with Bob Lambert about what efforts he might make to find out those names if he didn't know them?
I remember there being discussions, but I can't recall the actual detail and minutiae. But yes, we did have conversations. But trying to remember now what I said, I know, 40 odd years ago. No, my recollection is not good in that respect.
All right. Can we have a look at paragraph 3 of this report, please? And it asserts that he's read some publication called Without a Trace and is therefore acquainted with forensic science methods police use in the investigation of serious crime. In his own judgment, a minute search of his bedroom might still reveal sufficient traces of manufacture to link him to the crime. In particular, he is aware that testing devices in his fireplace may well have left indelible marks. However, in relation to the devices recovered by police, intact or in part, at the 3 department stores, he is confident that they will not provide any clues. That's information that's intended to be useful to the investigators, isn't it?
Yes.
So that they know where to go looking if they go into Mr. Clark's address for
Yeah.
forensic evidence of the
Yes.
manufacture. And that likewise would provide an evidential chain, an evidential link between the devices and Mr. Clark that doesn't require Mr. Lambert's role to be disclosed.
Yes, yes.
Or to be used evidentially, I should say.
Yes,
to be
that's
clear.
possible.
If we could look at paragraph 4 of this report, please. The first sentence reports that Mr. Clark is optimistic about avoiding detection, and then the paragraph continues, he is also aware that the next action carried out by his small cell will have to be planned and executed with an even greater regard for security. Again, this is quite clearly, even based on Mr. Lambert's reporting, a very small group of people who are privy to this information, isn't it?
Yes.
And they are, as this reports, acting with a great regard for security.
Yes.
Did that cause you to reflect on how close Mr. Lambert must have been to Mr. Clark and his cell, able to report all of this detail about the manufacture of incendiary devices?
Yes, it does suggest that.
He must have been, mustn't he, part of the cell to be able to obtain this information about forthcoming attacks.
Whether he was part of the cell or just an insider who just happens to be in a position to obtain this kind of, he's gained the confidence of the activist. Yes, he probably was very close. I don't think there's any doubt about that. But whether or not he went one step further, I can't be certain on that.
But it's a possibility.
Again, yeah.
Paragraph 5. He's also able to report now a provisional date for the next incendiary device attack. He gives 26th of September 1987, and he's confirming it won't be Debenhams, and a final decision as to the precise target will be drawn up during the next 3 weeks. And if we look, please, also at paragraph 6, Mr. Lambert was also reporting that Andrew Clark was looking into manufacturing a different kind of device here described as a lethal fireball, which was to be delivered in a jiffy bag, potentially put through letterboxes at night. Again, on reflection, this type of information, he knows the type of device, the likely date, the potential targets have been reported, and now Mr. Clark also contemplating a second type of incendiary device. Did you reflect at all on whether Mr. Lambert was too close to the plans for future action?
No, I didn't, because at that point there was no reason to question his credibility in this. I agree that the way this is written, he was very close to Clark. Whether he participated in it or not is a moot point. Again, in order to achieve some success for the investigators to follow up on, he must have been pretty close to the action. I mean, that's stating the obvious, I guess. But whether he went a step further in encouraging or arranging the construction of these devices, or whether he might have been an onlooker and an ambitious adherent of the cause, is anybody's guess. I wouldn't like to speculate on whether he did cross that line.
This is a report dated the 11th of August of 1987, so it's a month on from the Debenhams attacks.
Yes.
And we've still seen no mention in any of Mr. Lambert's written reporting that we've recovered of Jeff Shepherd. Does that surprise you?
Yes, I suppose it does, yes, of course.
Is your recollection, as best you can manage, that it was a whole month or more before Mr. Shepherd's name came onto your radar?
Yes.
That is consistent with your recollection, that it might have been as much as a month?
Well, it might have been. I mean, I can't recall, to be absolutely truthful.
Right. Could we take that report down, please, and have on the screen a report a week later on the 18th of August? It's MPS 0735382 B24B, sir. This is signed by Mr. Docker and not by you, Mr. MacLeod. And can we look, thank you, at paragraphs 2 and 3 to begin with? And I'll read this in. It says, on Thursday the 13th of August and Saturday the 15th of August 1987, an active London cell of the ALF held secret meetings in North and East London. Only 4 people were present. Paragraph 3, Andrew Clark, the cell's effective leader, announced that he had given up his full-time gardening job with Haringey Council in order to concentrate his efforts on the manufacture of further incendiary devices. Consequently, he considered it would now be possible to bring forward the date of the planned incendiary device attack on a leading West End store. This was agreed, and a date was set for Saturday the 29th of August 1987. The target was confirmed as Harrods of Knightsbridge, with devices to be placed on 4 separate floors to cause maximum fire and water damage. As usual, activists would aim to plant the firebomb shortly before closing time on the Saturday afternoon. Do you agree this is very specific intelligence about Mr. Clark's intentions for a forthcoming incendiary device attack?
Yes.
The 4 people present at the meetings, as quoting from paragraph 2, are not named. Does that strike you as odd?
Yes, it does.
Mr. Lambert must have been one of them, mustn't he, to be able to report this level of detail?
Yes, I guess so.
And so it follows, it appears, doesn't it, that he was at a meeting at which the date and target for a forthcoming incendiary device attack were agreed.
It looks that way.
Did that occur to you at the time?
No, I don't think it could have done.
Reflecting now, looking at this report, does it cause you concern that one of your officers appears to have been at a meeting at which agreement on these details was reached?
Yes, obviously it does, yes.
Because it appears, doesn't it, from this report, if not the earlier ones, that he is part of a small cell making plans for planting incendiary devices.
That's what it looks like, yes.
If we zoom out, please, and look at paragraph 4 of this report, we see a repetition of the issue of security. So it begins, considerable attention was paid to cell security. It was anticipated that at least one of the ALF activists used to plant the devices would not know Clark or have any firm knowledge of the origin of the devices. This was seen as part of an essential move towards separating the manufacture from all other areas of ALF activity. Whereas on the cell's last action, Clark had taken an active role, planting devices at Debenhams Luton branch. On this occasion, he decided he would take no part once the manufacture was completed. It was also agreed that he would be assisted in the process of manufacture by Jeff Shepherd. So this is where Jeff Shepherd pops up in the intelligence reporting. I'll carry on. The same safeguard would apply to him. Once the devices were made, Shepherd would take no further part in the action. Again, this contrasts with the last action on the 11th of July 1987, when it appears Shepherd was responsible for planting 2 devices at the Romford branch of Debenhams, having earlier assisted Clark in the manufacture at the latter's home address. So this is the first point in time in the written intelligence reporting at which we see assertions that Mr. Shepherd was involved in the manufacture of the Debenhams devices and that he was the planter at the Romford branch. Are you able to assist as to whether this was the first point in time when Mr. Lambert ever mentioned Jeff Shepherd's role in the Debenhams attacks?
Well, yes, I'm surprised that his name hasn't been mentioned earlier in this. I can't explain why, but I can see where you're coming from. It would be speculation on my part to suggest that there was something untoward in this, and it might have been that again, he might have got so close No, I can't add any more to it than that.
If I tell you that Robert Lambert's evidence to this inquiry was that he was obtaining his intelligence through Jeff Shepherd from the beginning, from the 14th of July,
That may well be the case.
would it surprise you in those circumstances in particular not to see any mention of Jeff Shepherd until late August?
Yes, it would surprise me, yes.
Can we just look at paragraph 5 before we leave this report? It goes on to say that for the same reasons of security, it was agreed that only Clark and Shepherd would discuss the detailed arrangements for manufacture. However, it is known that Clark has ready cash available, and both he and Shepherd will commence purchasing component parts forthwith. So Robert Lambert is reporting that only two people, only the manufacturers, are going to be privy to the detailed arrangements for the manufacture of these devices. It's clearly a cell with tight security in mind, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Just going back to the beginning of the report, which states that 4 people were present at these meetings, but doesn't name them in that first paragraph. It seems likely, doesn't it, that 2 of the 4 were Andrew Clark and Jeff Shepherd, now that we've looked at the content of the report.
Yes.
And you accepted when I asked you earlier that it seems likely that Robert Lambert was the 3rd. Can you think of any reason why the 4th person's name wouldn't have been included in the report if it was known?
I can't explain that away at all.
It would be helpful intelligence, wouldn't it, for, say, SO13?
Yes.
To know exactly who the 4 people were.
Yeah.
There's no good reason in terms of assisting their investigation to leave those names out.
Correct.
Have you any idea who the 4th person was?
No.
Right, can we take that report down? That's the 18th of August, that report is dated. And can we have up, please, MPS 0735361. It's B24A, sir. And Mr. MacLeod, this is a series of minutes. It's a minute sheet from a file. And if we look at minute 10 on the top of page 1 of this document. Please, thank you. It's from Mr. Short, Detective Chief and Superintendent Short. It's dated the 18th of August, so the same date as the report we've just been looking at. And it's covering the report that we've just been looking at. It's covering folio 10A, which is what we've just been looking at. And so it's clearly come to the attention of Mr. Short on the same day that it's dated, hasn't it? He's seen it quickly after its creation. And he says, he notes that the timescale has altered significantly. You'll recall that the report suggested that the date was being brought forward for the next attack, so he's noting that. And his view was that evidential surveillance needed to commence as soon as possible against Shepherd initially, who will lead us to Clark and establish where the manufacturing of incendiary devices will take place. Do you see that?
Yes.
And he wants to speak to Eric Docker, it seems from paragraph 2, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To protect the source.
Yep.
Are you able to assist? You may not be, given that he wanted to speak to Mr. Docker, but are you able to assist as to what steps to protect the source might have been in mind? What would the nature of the liaison have been between the SDS and Mr. Short?
The liaison with STS and Mr. Short.
So they're beginning a surveillance operation,
Yes.
and they want to talk to the SDS about source protection. Is that, for example, to keep Robert Lambert out of any surveillance operation so that he doesn't appear?
I don't know what the thinking was behind that, but
Any recollection of you being involved in discussions with Mr. Short or someone from his team
I
about source protection?
I can't remember being involved in this exchange at all. I don't know why not. I see that Eric Docker standing in for me, so I really don't have anything useful to add to this.
Right, I'll take that down. Can we have a look, please? Oh, sorry, it's the same document, but minute 12, so over the page. Page 2, thank you, at the bottom. Right. You can't see it on the page, but this minute 12, is dated the 24th of August.
Yes.
So it's 6 days after the one we were just looking at.
Yeah.
And that was a Monday, in case that assists you. And the author of this minute is somebody who we are calling TN42, in case you want to check the cipher list before I begin.
42.
You got that?
Got it.
So this is TM42, a minute that appears to be for the attention of the Assistant Commander of Operations, and he is recording that Docker informed him that afternoon, so the afternoon of the 24th of August, that information had been received from a secret and reliable source, which showed that Harrods was no longer to be the target for the proposed ALF incendiary campaign. That secret and reliable source will be Lambert, won't it? Most likely, coming from Docker.
I would say so. I would speculate.
And the minute records that it had been decided that Clark would identify and reconnoitre 3 new targets during Monday and Tuesday, the 24th and 25th of August. And then on Wednesday, the 26th of August, Shepherd would transport the necessary components to Clark's address, where the 2 men would assemble 4 devices and arrange for them to be planted by others unknown on Friday the 28th of August. So it appears, doesn't it, that by the 24th of August, despite what was said in earlier reports about Clark and Shepherd discussing detailed arrangements only between themselves, that Mr. Lambert is able to report that the target has changed and that the arrangements for manufacture have also changed and will take place on the 26th of August, with Shepherd transporting components to Clark's address. Do you recall becoming aware of these changes?
No.
Aware of the intended date for the next incendiary devices being brought forward?
No.
That doesn't ring any bells with
No.
you? Is it possible you knew at the time, but you can't recall it now?
I'm pretty certain I didn't know at the time.
And can you think why you might not have been made aware of this at the time?
I can't. There's no reason why I shouldn't have been. There may have been a good reason, but I can't think of.
Right, if we could look just before lunch, if we've time, at the next minute, minute 13, which is the same day. So still the 24th of August, still TN42, and TN42 has apprised Commander Churchill Coleman of these developments. And I'll read, at my suggestion, he agreed that Detective Inspector Gray, SO13, should now be briefed on the operation. Accordingly, D.I. Gray attended room 1824 at 6:30 p.m. and was briefed by me in the presence of Detective Sergeant Beals. D.I. Gray is now making the necessary preparatory arrangements for search warrants to be obtained and executed sometime on Wednesday, the 26th of August 1987. Detective Inspector Black has been updated on the intelligence relevant to the surveillance operation, and another detective inspector was making urgent inquiries to obtain a suitable observation post, giving coverage of Shepherd's address. So Bob Lambert's intelligence, as relayed by Docker to TN42, appears to have prompted a number of actions to be taken, gearing up for surveillance and potentially an arrest. Is that a fair summary of what we see
Yes.
happening in these minutes? So
Yeah.
SO13 being involved on the back of Bob Lambert's intelligence
Yes.
to get ready for arrests.
Correct.
All right, thank you. Given the time, I suggest we go to the next document after lunch.
Certainly. We'll resume at 2.